Even before I dissect this program and speak about the various new terms that you have heard of, let us quickly take another programming example. Well, this time the programming example is to compute the simple interest. Well, I am sure all of you know the simple interest formula, that it is computed as PTR by 100, where P happens to be the principal amount, T happens to be the time of repayment provided, and rate of interest is what is R, and PTR by 100 is anyway going to give you the simple interest. I am sure during your school days you would have solved problems in mathematics wherein you would have computed the simple interest. But then what really is simple interest? Even before I give you the programming code, let me very quickly tell you that, say supposing there is an individual who wants to start a business. Hence, he, say supposing, approaches the bank and takes a loan of rupees 1 lakh from the bank. Now, that is what is called as the principal amount. And then obviously when you are going to take the loan from the bank, you need to tell as to what is the time duration in which you would wish to pay back the loan. Well, the banks could give you the opportunity to pay it back in 3 years, maybe pay it back in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years and so on. And here we assume that the person who is taking the loan from the bank to maybe set up a new business is going to make a promise to make the repayment in 5 years, and that is what is actually the time duration. Well, you also know that the bank is just not going to give you the money without actually charging any interest. Otherwise, how is it that the banks would be able to function? Of course, the banks would not be offering you the loan on simple interest. There are various other kinds of calculations that really the bank does before offering the loan to you. But to make matters simple, let's assume that our bank is actually offering the loan on a simple interest, and obviously the simple interest means that there is a certain rate of interest that you have to pay back to the bank along with the principal amount by the end of the 5 years. And say supposing the bank tells that the rate of interest happens to be 6.5%. Now, what you really have to be calculating is the simple interest, and obviously by making use of the formula, if you would compute the simple interest, you would be getting it as 32,500 rupees. So what does that really mean? Well, what it really means is that the person who has taken the loan from the bank to set up his own business, when he makes the repayment, obviously he will have to repay that 1 lakh of the principal amount that he had taken. Along with that 1 lakh, he has to pay back the bank an additional 32,500 rupees, obviously spread across a duration of 5 years. In other words, in total, the person would be returning to the bank a total of 1,32,500 rupees over a duration of 5 years. I hope now you've been able to understand the backdrop of what really simple interest is. But then the challenge is, how are we going to achieve writing a program for this using a programming language like C? Let me tell you as to how we can code it using C. Well, if we will have to code this program using C language, then it means that we need to be abiding by Dennis Ritchie's rule. You know that this happens to be the general structure of the C program, and obviously the preprocessor directive section is going to have this statement. Well, at this point in time, I may not be able to tell what really is the role of it, but all that I can tell you at this point is that if at all you are going to make use of the input-output statements of C. What I mean to say is that if at all you are going to make use of the printfs and the scanfs in C, then it means that you need to be including this. Well, what it really means anyway, as I have told you, I would be telling you moving forward. And then in the basic structure, you have something called the global variables, and I don't need it this time as well, so I wouldn't be considering that. But then you know that the main method obviously has to be there. And within the main method, what we also call as the main function, you should be having a few local declarations. Now, what local declarations? Well, Dennis Ritchie doesn't tell you as to what really are the local declarations that you have to have. It is you as a programmer who has to decide, and Dennis Ritchie has just given you the basic structure. All that he is telling is that before you provide any kind of an executable statement, just ensure that you are going to create the variables, whatever variables are needed as per your programming requirements. Well, you know we would be needing 4 variables. The first variable that I would be needing is the principal, so that I can store that 1 lakh in that variable called principal. The second variable is time, so that I can store that 5 years, that is 5, inside that variable. The third one I would be needing is the rate of interest, so that I can store 6.5 in that, and obviously I should also have a location to store my simple interest. Now you also know that C language happens to be a statically typed programming language, which means that we need to be providing the data type as well. Well, for that matter, principal, I can be declaring it as int, but then to be on the safer side, maybe I would be declaring it as of type float. And not just that, even the time as well, I can be declaring it as either int or float, but then since it is 5 years that I would be actually considering, maybe I would be declaring it as of type int. Well, this is actually going to introduce to you another data type of C language as well, right? Anyway, if you would wish to declare time as of type float, it's your choice. I have declared it as of type int. And then definitely the rate of interest, I cannot be declaring it as int, because you know I want to store a 6.5 in that particular variable, which means that it is a real number, and hence I will have to be storing it as a float type variable. And then obviously the simple interest as well. You know that for our numbers it was 32,500, which is the simple interest, and to be on the safer side, it is always good that I declare it as the float. And this is what Dennis Ritchie was saying, that you need to make all the local variables declarations first, and only after this that you can have the executable statements. Now, what executable statements? Obviously I will have to be giving a value to the principal, I would be giving the value of time, I would be giving the value of rate of interest. Yes, by now I am sure that my learners are already concerned that I am hard coding and this is not a good style of programming. Well, you have seen the limitations of hard coding previously. Definitely I would be giving you the other version as well, but at this point in time I am sure you are able to understand that all of these is what we call as the executable statements. But then not just this, you know, you also have to include the formula, right? Otherwise, how is it that your program is going to be computing the simple interest? In other words, this happens to be the statement in which you have made use of the formula. And you can notice that in the formula, you have made use of these operators. After all, star is the operator which is performing multiplication, slash is the operator which is performing division. That way there are numerous operators in C language. Any which way we would be taking up the discussion about the operators moving ahead. But then after you have done all of that, I am sure you understand that it's your responsibility to print the simple interest, and that is what is actually being done here. Again, I repeat, don't bother much about the %f and all of that. All that I really want you to understand is that this print command, if at all you have to use, you should have included the stdio.h, which you have done, and obviously this statement is going to be printing the final simple interest for you. I'm sure now you've been able to understand the program, and if I will have to execute it, you know that I first have to convert it into zeros and ones. In other words, I have to actually compile the program. Anyway, upon compilation, as you can notice, I am getting 0 errors and 0 warnings, and now I can proceed ahead with the execution. And when I am going to execute it, I am going to get the answer that the simple interest happens to be 32,500. Well, you know that the simple interest is 32,500. That doesn't mean that you will be paying 32,500 back to the bank. You will be paying your principal amount plus the simple interest back to the bank. Well, that is not actually indicated in the output. Why is it not indicated in the output? Because you have never factored it in your program. What I mean to say is that I would include this line. Yes, as you can notice in this line, I am specifying that the total amount that I am going to be repaying is actually the principal amount plus the simple interest. Anyway, now that you have been able to understand, when I would compile, no errors or warnings, and when I would execute, this happens to be the output, where it is clearly indicating that the simple interest happens to be 32,500, but then what is the total amount that you would be repaying back to the bank is 1,32,500 after a duration of 5 years. I hope you have now been able to understand the program, and at the same time I am sure you also know the limitation. Well, I am sure that you are not only aware of the limitation, you are also aware as to how you can overcome the limitation by eliminating the hard coding and making use of the series of printfs and scanf with respect to the principal, with respect to the time, with respect to the rate of interest. And I am sure you know the problem associated with this program. Yes, after all, you have hard coded the inputs. Obviously, hard coding the inputs is not a good thing, because in the previous session you've been able to understand that whenever you are going to hard code the inputs, then each time that you will have to execute the program with different inputs, then you need to come into the source code, change the data in the source code, and then after that you need to recompile the whole program and then execute it. Obviously, it is going to be a time consuming process, and that's precisely the reason that this is not a very efficient way of coding the program. Well, then what is a better way out? All that I really will have to do is to remove this, yes, and then bring in a pair of printf and scanf statements. Well, you know that the printf statement is going to print that particular message asking to enter the value of principal, and then whatever is entered through the keyboard, obviously the scanf is going to take it from the keyboard and it is going to be placing it inside the variable called as principal. Yes, we have made use of an ampersand, and also we have made use of %f, which is technically called as a format specifier, about which definitely moving ahead we would be discussing. But all said and done, if you'll ask me that in the broader thing as to what really has happened, well, the hard-coded input, this was the hard-coded input, which has now been changed into a manner where the input is going to be received from the console. Well, in this case, the console is going to be the keyboard. Similarly, it is needless for me to say that these two statements as well have to be changed by the corresponding pairs of the printf and the scanf statements. Well, here I would just wish to highlight one point, that %d is the format specifier that you will really have to make use of. Well, for those who really don't know as to what really is the format specifier is, it would really not be right on my part to even tell what %d is. But then let me tell you that whenever through the keyboard you are going to be reading an integer value, and I want you to notice that time is not of type float, it is of type int, and whenever you are going to read an integer value from the keyboard, what really the scanf has to have as the format specifier is the %d. And I'm sure now you understand that through the keyboard, if you are reading a real number, then definitely it needs to be collected using the format specifier %f. But then the larger question as to why did really Dennis Ritchie design C language in this manner, wherein if really something has to be read from the keyboard, as to why do we need these format specifiers? If that is really the question that is bothering you, let me tell you that definitely in this course moving ahead you will get to know everything that you have to get to know. But then at this point in time, I am sure you are able to understand that this program has been modified in a manner wherein the input can be provided through the keyboard. Well, let's execute and check as to what really is going to be the difference. Well, you know that if in case I will have to execute it for the first time, I need to be compiling the program. Upon compilation, you can notice that there are 0 errors and warnings, and hence I will have to proceed towards the execution. And as you can notice, during the execution, it is asking me to enter the principal. Well, I think you can understand as to which is that printf which is really getting executed. Well, because of the printf, the user tends to see this message on the console, and hence, say supposing you enter 1 lakh. Well, don't you see that you are entering it through the keyboard, and hence you have the next statement present in your program, that is the scanf, in order to collect this 1 lakh and place it inside the variable called principal. and then immediately it is the next printf command that is going to execute, and hence you already have this second statement on the console. And say supposing you enter the duration as maybe 5 years, and then you know that the scanf is going to be collecting it and placing it in the appropriate variable, after which the printf is actually going to ask you for this rate of interest, and just in case you key in as 6.5, then it is the corresponding scanf which is going to be reading it from the keyboard, and then immediately the formula is going to be used to calculate, and then the corresponding print commands have actually printed this output on the output screen. So what I think you've been able to understand through this is that the default control flow in a program happens to be sequential. Well, this is one of the statements that you very often happen to hear in the computer science and programming related textbooks, that the default control flow is always sequential. Now what it means is that if in case you have not made use of any control construct such as the if or the if-else or the nested if-else or the switch, well, if you really are not aware of these terms, just don't worry about it. Definitely you would get to know about it. Well, the point I want you to understand is that if in case in your program you have not made use of any control constructs, be it the decision control constructs or the looping control constructs like the for loop or the while loop or the do while loop, just in case you have not used any of that, then what is the control flow going to be like? Well, the default control flow or the automatic control flow is always sequential. Didn't you notice that it was this statement that first got executed, followed by the next one, the next one, the next one, till the last one? Well, this is the way really the execution is going to happen. And if you'll ask me, who is it that who really begins the execution of that first statement? Well, let me tell you, the execution of a C program always begins from the main function. And if you'll ask me as to who actually tells the main function to execute, let me tell you that it is the operating system which is going to hand over the control to the main function. And then the main function is going to execute every single line that is present within itself, line by line. And since you can notice that you have not made use of any control construct, that the control flow happens to be sequential. And if you really have a question as to what really happens after all of the statements are executed, well, after all of the statements are executed, the control goes back to the same place from where the control was given to the main function. Well, what I mean to say is that after all, the main function received control from the operating system and began its execution. And after the execution is completed, main function very honestly is going to hand over the control back to the operating system. Well, for those who are looking at the output and are wondering as to what better is it, after all, it is producing the same result. Let me very quickly tell you that if you really want to execute this program with a different set of values, then obviously there is no need for you to recompile the program. What I mean to say is that I'm not going to recompile, I'm just going to execute, and you can notice that the second time it is asking me to enter the principal. And this time maybe I would be entering the principal as 1,50,000 rupees. And then, it is going to be asking me the time duration for repayment. Maybe I'll enter it as 3 years, and then the rate of interest, I would enter it as 7.0%, in which case we get to see that 31,500 rupees happen to be the simple interest, and the total amount that really needs to be returned by the person who has taken the loan from the bank happens to be 1,81,500 rupees. In other words, without actually recompiling the program, you have been able to execute the same program with a different set of values, because you know that you have coded your program in such a manner that you are not hard coding any inputs. Rather, you have coded your program in such a manner that it actually takes the input from the console. I'm sure you have now been able to understand the improvised version, but then it is time now for me to dissect this improvised version. Tell you as to what really are the symbols present in this, what really are the tokens and the statements and all of these terms and the rules associated with these terms is what I will have to be discussing with you. In other words, What I really would be discussing with you happens to be the syntax of the C programming language.